My name is Matt, and let's look at some busted Legacy lands. Soul lands are at the core of a mana base that powers several decks in Legacy. We call Ancient Tomb and City of Traders Soul lands because they make the same amount of mana as one of the most powerful cards in Magic, Soul Ring. To offset their high power level, each of these has a downside. City of Traders must be sacrificed if its controller plays another land afterwards, while Ancient Tomb costs 2 life every single time it's tapped for mana. We also see similar lands that can make multiple mana, but I won't classify them as soul lands, nor really explore their uses. There are a couple of categories of similar but different lands. Gaia's Cradle, Sarah's Sanctum, and Phyrexian Tower can all make more than 1 mana, but all depend on other permanents already being in play. Sandstone Needle and the other Mask's Depletion lands have a similar effect, but are distinctly less powerful, as they are both slower and provide mana for only a few turns. Some other options sort of split the difference. Crystal Vein and the sack lands like Dwarven Ruins can make consistent mana, then provide a burst of 2 mana when sacrificed. What makes the soul lands powerful? That might seem like a silly question. The intuitive answer is they make 2 mana, you dummy. And they certainly do make 2 mana. But why is this good? I want to go back to basics for a moment to thoroughly answer this question. Mana is one of the primary resources of the game alongside with card quantity. The game design of Magic has a supply and demand curve of mana production being the supply and cards in hand to spend mana on being demand. A common shorthand used to represent this is the player that spends more mana wins the game. It's a way of saying that the player whose mana supply meets their mana demand can take more game actions and better leverage their resources to ideally outpace their opponent. One of the unique aspects of Eternal formats like Legacy is that there are tools to increase mana supply on the turn that they are played, things called fast mana. There are many forms of fast mana, but outside of soul lands, we have the Moxen, Rituals, Lotus Petal, and Spirit Guides. Apart from soul lands, the persistent fast mana sources are cards like Chrome Mox and Mox Diamond, each requiring a 2-card investment in order to actually produce mana. One-shot effects like Rituals, Petals, Guides are inherently not persistent mana sources. They give you a one-shot. Rituals often provide more mana, but require an initial mana investment, while Petal and Spirit Guides can be used as an initial mana source, but they are limited to making just a single mana. Soul lands are kind of unique in Legacy in that they increase mana supply the same turn that they are played, they are persistent mana sources, and they only cost a single card in the form of a land drop to make this effect. To illustrate the power of this, let's compare them in a vacuum to a basic land. If we look at a curve where one deck plays a soul land on turn 1 and does not make another land drop, versus a deck that makes a land drop every turn using basic lands or dual lands, it takes until turn 3 for the deck playing regular lands to catch up on cumulative mana generation, and 3 times as many cards invested compared to the soul land deck. Not only is this fast, but it also illustrates a form of card advantage where fewer resources need to be invested into the mana base. Ancient Tomb and City of Traders are good because they make 2 mana each turn, but more importantly, they are the most stable and card-compact way to do so in Legacy. Without delving into the nitty-gritty, it's easy to see how a deck that plays Ancient Tomb into City of Traders can accrue a huge mana advantage. These lands provide a confluence of 3 separate advantages: ramp, fast mana, and a form of card advantage. While powerful and standalone, not requiring the use of any additional resources in order to generate mana, the soul lands do impose a pretty significant deck building cost. They only make colorless mana, meaning that there are limitations on what the mana can be spent on. Efficiency is an extremely important component of card choice in Magic overall, with Legacy having access to all cards printed, barring the ban list. If we look at some of the most played cards in the format, we see a clear lack of colorless mana costs in Legacy staples. There are cards like Force of Will and Grief that are essentially 0 mana in most situations. Threats like Delver, Orcish Bowmasters, Elvish Reclaimer, and Murktide Regent that require either all or mostly all of their costs to be paid by colored mana sources. The deck building restriction when playing soul lands is kind of obvious. Spells need to be castable using the colorless mana from Ancient Tomb and City of Traders. Basically, they need to have 2 or more colorless mana in their mana costs. Cards like this kind of fall into 2 categories: colorless 2 to 4 mana spells like Chalice of the Void and the One Ring, and monocolored 3-drops that require only a single colored mana to cast, like Goblin Rabblemaster or Show and Tell. Urza's Saga is a common inclusion in soul land decks. While it's not really a card that you cast because it's a land, the second chapter ability where it makes a construct is a very clean way to spend the mana from a soul land. Costs 2 to make a construct, soul lands make 2 mana. Because of this dynamic where they only make 2 colorless mana, soul lands incentivize a very different kind of deck construction compared to the rest of Legacy. If we look at the mana curve of a couple of decks, the differences I think are obvious. In an attempt to compare like for like, here are some fair decks without soul lands and a couple fair decks with soul lands. I'm defining fair decks as decks that win exclusively through combat damage, while having some tools to interact with or disrupt the opponent's game plan. The Temur Delver mana curve, excluding free and 0 mana spells, has a lot of 1s, some 2s, and flexibility in how much mana to spend on Murktide Regent. Another fair deck, Maverick, has a curve skewed towards 1s, 2s, and some 3s with a single 4-drop. Green Sun Zenith can be cast for many mana costs, but it's frequently cast for 1 mana to find Dryad Arbor. This deck, a classic Soul Land deck, Mud, from my friend Jim Monolith, a man who loves Mud so much he changed his entire real legal name, has a curve that realistically starts at 2, has some 3s and 4s, with a small number of 1s that are primarily used as search targets for Urza's Saga. The Moon Stompy curve starts at 2, with Chalice the Void usually being cast for X equals 1. We see a lot of 3s, and then a playset of 5s in Fury, which can either be evoked or hardcast. We see a pretty big difference in the mana costs of cards being played between these different decks. Soul Land decks frequently have a mana curve that realistically starts at 2 mana, whereas decks without sometimes top out at 2 mana with a much higher focus on 1-drops. This is not necessarily representative of all decks that include Ancient Tomb and City of Traders. These mana curves, they illustrate the incentives and costs associated with leveraging a Soul Land mana base. I think the upsides of Soul Lands are pretty clear. They provide mana quickly and efficiently, allowing the Soul Land player to outpace their opponent and run away with the game. These upsides come with risks and vulnerabilities, consistency being the foremost of these. In order to take advantage of this compact mana engine, we're incentivized to play 2 to 4 mana cost cards that can be cast using Ancient Tomb and City of Traders. Because a maximum of 8 combined copies of Tomb and City can be included in a legacy deck, this means that casting these cards without a Soul Land is often too slow and possibly too low impact for the format. Consider the difference between playing a Chalice of the Void on turn 1 versus on turn 2 when playing Moonstompy. On the play with a Soul Land, we can play Soul Land, Chalice, cutting our opponent off from casting a 1-drop on turn 1, while also being immune to being dazed, as our opponent has not yet made a land drop, being able to play an island to then, daze. If we have a hand that does not include any fast mana, we take this same situation, we play a mountain and pass. Our opponent plays a Volcanic Island and a Delver. We can still cast Chalice on turn 2, but a Delver's already in play, and our opponent can now daze our Chalice, unlocking their future cantrips and 1-drops. I think this difference is obvious, but it has implications in mulligan decisions. Soul Land decks often have a narrower band of capable hands compared to non-Soul Land decks, meaning that mulligans are more likely. An increased number of mulligans can offset the pseudo-card advantage provided by an Ancient Tomb or City of Traders. You've likely guessed the second vulnerability, which is Wasteland. At the time of writing, there's a greater than 50% chance that an opponent is playing a Wasteland in their deck. Because Soul Lands incentivize deck building with spells that are too slow when cast with regular lands, this means that Wasteland has a larger than normal impact on these decks. There are many ways that a player can attempt to mitigate these risks, but they often come with their own costs. An example is Mystic Forge Artifact combo, where some of these lists play Serum Powder to effectively increase the number of mulligans that they can take, but this inclusion adds some dead draws during the game. Let's look at some of the categories of decks that play Soul Lands and some of the individual decks within each category. We're going to start with Stompy and Prison decks. I'm grouping them together as they operate on a spectrum with aggressive threats on one end of the spectrum and long pieces on the other, but each category is trying to resolve 2 to 4 drops ahead of curve. The more aggressive Stompy decks, like Boros Initiative, typically focus on leveraging the fast mana from Soul Lands and other fast mana like Chrome Mox, Spirit Guide, and Lotus Petal to play overcosted threats early and overwhelm the opponent. On the other hand, Prison decks like Mud and Stax have a primary focus on using cards like Chalice the Void, Trinisphere, and Sphere of Resistance to effectively prevent the opponent from making plays. Moonstompy falls roughly in the middle of this spectrum, combining a significant number of lock pieces with a roughly equivalent number of standalone threats. We've also got hybrid decks like Painter, Cauldron, and Bomberman, all have fast combo kills enabled by Soul Lands and a respectable beatdown plan. These decks often lean on Urza's Saga as well to flesh out that beatdown plan. Some of these decks play lock pieces like Chalice, others like Painter opt for a larger amount of removal or interaction like Pyroblast. There are a lot of dedicated combo decks that leverage Soul Lands. I don't know if I can realistically list them all. They do typically fall into a couple of categories though: spell-based, artifact-based, and A plus B combo decks. I think the Show and Tell decks are the most popular of the A plus B combo decks that include Soul Lands. Typically, they leverage Soul Lands and fast mana to play a turn 1 or turn 2 Show and Tell, putting in Omniscience, Emrakul, or Atraxa, or in the good old days, Gristlebrand, while still having enough resources left to have, say, Force of Will, or some cantrips, or some other interaction. The artifact-based combo decks include stuff like Mystic Forge combo and Jewel artifacts, using Soul Lands to gain a huge mana advantage and go over the top of opponents using high mana cost card advantage engines like the One Ring, Mystic Forge, and Coveted Jewel plus copy artifact effects. The Epic Gamble is the deck that I think of when pondering soul land spell-based combo decks. It's roughly 2/3 rituals and fast mana and soul lands. It's got a playset of defense grid, and the rest are card draw spells and wish effects to either draw cards or fetch a win condition. The final prominent soul land combo deck is Creative Technique or Mississippi River, a sort of one-card combo deck that's extremely consistent, but it's pretty vulnerable to Wasteland and dedicated hate cards like Damping Sphere and Deafening Silence. Apart from Stompy, Prison, Hybrid, and combo decks, there are some other decks leveraging Ancient Tomb. Green-White Sphere Lands only plays a couple copies of Ancient Tomb to increase the number of hands where it's able to consistently play a Sphere of Resistance on turn 1, but it does already have a playset of Mox Diamond and is somewhat content with playing a Sphere on turn 2. Colorless Cloudpost decks are not very common these days, but they often leverage Soul Lands in conjunction with Cloudpost and Glimmerpost to power out big colorless threats, often the smaller Eldrazi creatures like Thought-Knot Seer. I also want to briefly draw a distinction between decks that rely on Soul Lands for their primary game plan versus decks that include them without necessarily relying on them. Decks like Moonstompy have few functional hands without a Soul Land, whereas a deck like the Epic Gamble has a wide range of them. This really depends on what the deck is trying to do and what resources need to be leveraged in order to achieve that end. What if you want to play your Ancient Tombs, but you don't like any of these existing decks? I think you can try and brew. We often see a lot of innovation occur with decks powered by Soul Lands. There's a huge number of viable combo decks built leveraging Ancient Tomb and City of Traders, and there are many cards that would not be powerful or efficient enough in Legacy unless played in conjunction with Soul Lands. And there are constantly new cards being printed, so there will always be new and fresh ways to play with these lands. I think a really good example of this is the Affinity deck that emerged just after the introduction of Simulacrum Synthesizer in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. This deck leverages artifact synergies to go over the top of opponents while being able to leverage some interaction in the form of Metallic Rebuke and some silver bullets searchable with Urza Saga. Simulacrum Synthesizer would not be fast enough for Legacy without Soul Lands providing the additional mana to cast it, and then cast the other 3+ mana cost cards to accrue value. It does seem like a pretty good deck, and conveniently can play through some of the most popular artifact hate like Meltdown and Pernicious Deed due to the high mana values of many of its threats. So try some stuff, and maybe you'll break the already broken Soul Lands. Now that we have a fundamental understanding of the Soul Lands, I want to explore playing with them. Playing with Soul Lands can be difficult to resolve down to a core competency, but not like that's going to stop me from trying. This is because the skills needed to play a deck like Boros Initiative is vastly different from those needed to play a deck like Omni-Tell, and yet again vastly different than those needed to play the Epic Gamble. I think two key components to keep top of mind are mulligan decisions and sequencing. For Stompy and Prison decks, we usually aim to keep hands that make an impactful proactive play on turn 1 or 2 at the latest, and are able to survive an opposing wasteland and or daze if possible. Sequencing correctly can be difficult, but ideally be as mana efficient as possible while trying to play around Wasteland and Daze. I think these same principles apply to the artifact combo decks like Jewel and Mystic Forge combo, but admittedly these are decks that are not really within my range. Omni-Tell and Sneak and Show can be a little bit more forgiving with their sequencing and mulligan decisions, as they often include 8+ cantrips and include the Soul Lands as a way to accelerate out their show and tells and not as a core component of their game plan. The new Affinity deck has similar dynamics to the Stompy and Prison decks, with Metalcraft and Affinity being additional ways to gain mana advantage without necessarily having to draw a Soul Land. Sequencing is even more important here, as cards, costs, and effects can change depending on the order in which they are played, with both Patchwork and Simulacrum accruing advantage for subsequent artifacts, while cards like Mox Opal and the Affinity creatures need the artifacts already to be in play. Our sequencing with any of these decks can inadvertently provide information to our opponents, but this can also be used to mislead them as well. Despite being sometimes considered an easy or beginner decks, Soul Land decks have an incredible amount of depth, but do require a different skill set than many other Legacy decks. So why should you play with Soul Lands? I think you should play with Soul Lands because they're fun and powerful. I would recommend that you play decks with Soul Lands if you enjoy sequencing and don't mind aggressive mulliganing. They may or may not be a great choice for you if you prefer to cast cantrips, favor interaction like Force of Will or Discard, but love them or hate them, Soul Lands are a core pillar of Legacy gameplay, so understanding the dynamics they introduce is critical to success, regardless of which side of the matchup you're on. If you're not practiced with these decks, I would encourage you to play some games with at least some of them if you have the opportunity, as it can be invaluable in learning how to beat them. Maybe I'm bad, but I routinely find that playing the opposite side of a matchup helps me immensely in improving my gameplay. Thanks for watching. I appreciate you sticking around until the end. Please let me know what you think and if I missed anything important. I am planning on going a little bit more in-depth on each of these prominent Soul Land decks in the future, so if that sounds interesting, subscribe so you can catch those videos when I release them.